Today is Friday, February 21st, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we doing today?
Doing fantastic. It's the end of the day. We're starting a little bit later than we normally do on a Friday, but at the end of the week as well. Productive week. Looking forward to the Sabbath.
Yes, I am as well. So what do we have on tap for today?
Well, today we had actually gotten a comment that I appreciate. It was pointing out that we often point our teens who are listening to their parents, but the recognition that we have quite a mix among us. Not to mention we have the stray non-church person who stumbles across the podcast, and sometimes you have some who might have challenges with their parents one way or another, or some who might have a parent not in the church. How does all this apply? In particular, the Bible says, honor your parents, and sometimes there are things in life that might make that seem difficult. So we thought, hey, why not talk about that?
Well, my family was perfect, and I executed that flawlessly, so I'm not sure what I'll add, Mr. Smith, but sounds like a great topic.
Thanks. Thank you, Jake and Julia. And I hear what you're saying, Mr. Robinson, because I also have been a perfect father at all times. I know my wife has been a perfect mother, so clearly my children won't relate to this topic at all.
Well, even if my father was slightly out of sorts, I was always like, yes, Father, whatever you require. No, not at all. I not to get into it too early, but I did not have a perfect family, and I certainly did not execute that flawlessly.
Well, and I think as we'll get into, when God gives a command, like honor your father and mother, it's like his commands about not committing adultery and other things. He does recognize we're living in an imperfect world for these things. And so let's go to more specific commands. When he commands a husband to love his wife and a wife to submit to her husband, he's not saying there's a perfect world and that your husband will always be the most amazing man. You can't help but submit to that person, or that your wife will always be so super loving. How can you do anything but love her? No, that's often why it's a command.
Yep.
Because we're tempted in many ways to do the opposite, and we need to be encouraged.
And the irony is actually, because quite a bit of study has been done, and just take husbands and wives. If it's too easy, actually, the marriage is not good long term.
That's fascinating.
There needs to be a little bit of tension for both, and it kind of forces everybody into a little bit of growth that we would not have if things were too easy.
Yeah, I would actually question if it's too easy. That'd be really strange. I will say, we do have some housekeeping things I need to say first. First, thank you to all of you, the 60 plus of you who actually signed up to give us feedback in the future. And let me apologize that we had to delete all of that data. So we had to delete it because we've never really made a form before. I haven't made a form like that. And come to find out, we have to have certain privacy concerns in place. And so I have now talked to our department that will help us craft it in such a way that you don't have to worry. Like, for instance, some of you listening are under 18. Well, your parents have to fill out things like that, or we actually can't use that data. So we're having to make a new form that keeps those things in mind. And I appreciate the advice that we have to do that. So anyway, I apologize, but just know out there, you who signed up, that we do appreciate you. Thank you for doing that, and I'll do it right next time and put a new link. So that'll be coming up. Want to make sure that you are aware about that. Then secondly, this is based on a comment. Today's topic. Someone had written in pointing that we point our younger listeners to their parents, but that there's challenges out there where we actually do have. It's a rare, but we even have some teenagers that attend with us whose both their parents aren't in the church necessarily. That's a circumstance. We have some who are in very different circumstances. I know in my case, growing up, I was not in the church, and I don't want to go into a lot of details, but let's just say there were reasons why I wouldn't always, like, well, how do you respect so-and-so under this circumstance? It can be challenging with our parents. And we'll get into different kind of categories, but let me also say, sometimes it's not that our parents are doing anything necessarily in particularly wrong, but it just seems to rub us wrong. Like, it's we just can't fathom why they would make such a demand of us. I don't understand, or we can't fathom, why is it I can't go out with my friends in their church friends, and it seems like it's a healthy environment, and for some reason they're making this decision, and I just can't. They do this all the time, and I just don't understand. And so it might seem like it's hard to respect or honor our parents in circumstances like that. And I think I mentioned before the music. I'm not sure. We had to do multiple takes on that first version. But we have there has to be at least one person who's not in the church who has found the podcast and listened before. Because I know when it comes to statistics on Spotify, et cetera, there was someone who listened once and identified as a non-binary particular. It's just one lone statistic that kind of passed through in the experience. So we have even listeners sometimes who it's actually new to them, the idea that that you would even talk to your parents about things, and they might have truly difficult circumstances. I will say that in general, it is a blessing to have parents in the church. It really is a blessing, and it's a challenge for us to talk about a topic like this because I think Mr. Robinson and I would both agree on this. Go figure. We work together, and we understand what God wants in terms of a family.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. It frustrates me when I see, say, school systems in the world seeking to insert themselves between parents and their children. Like as a rule, as a course. And I've worked in the public school system, and this was back in the 90s before it was nearly what it has become today. And I can, as much as I loved my coworkers at the time, I could see a certain attitude amongst some where they certainly felt of themselves that they were actually the better parent of their students. Their kids have their parents, but then there's me. And I'm more enlightened, and I do better by them. I do better by them than their parents do, and that is such a dangerous attitude to the point that way back early on, when my children were still preteen camp preteens, they were just getting into preteen age, and the church had all these camps, and I was a little. It's like, well, I'd like my kids to go to camp when they get old enough, but I don't want a system that's inserting itself between me and my children, and I didn't know what to expect. Thankfully, the moment, our oldest, when he was of age to go to the preteen camp, we talked with Mr. Agwin. He was actually running the preteen camp there in Texas, and come to find out it was just the opposite, that this was a camp that wanted to support me as a parent, that was not trying to insert itself. It's, if anything, trying to make my life easier as a parent. And I appreciated that. So it can be a touchy topic.
Yeah, I'm sure I had some very good teachers. We both.
I did.
Our age is very similar, and so we both grew up in Texas, going to public school about roughly the same time. Mm-hmm. And I still remember some of the teachers I had, and they were wonderful. But they are not a substitute for your parents.
They're just not.
It's just not. And I, it makes me wonder there in the 90s, as you're talking about it, maybe that was the kind of the beginning of where we are now, where we sort of are like, we turned our civilization over to the experts.
Maybe.
So, but
and we lost sight of the idea that God actually has put people, that we kind of set aside, that God has assigned people to roles. So we're going to reevaluate and say, well, who are the people that should be in these roles?
In certain circumstances, they were trying to make it so that kids could get counseled and considered for a gender change without the parents being notified.
Oh, yeah.
Appalling.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% appalling.
Now, one thing I might mention about this as we start is it was a good path for me to go through and a good realization to have, which is, I was in jest at the beginning, of course, of the podcast, but I did realize pretty early into my 20s that I had grown up in a very good situation. My father could have a bit of a temper, so there were things about it that were a challenge, but what I came to realize later is I had a very typical upbringing, normal challenges, the normal tension between brothers and sisters, between moms and dads and their kids, and going to public school and just all of that. And that was a challenge and shaped me. But then when I got older and I started comparing my story with other people's stories, I was like, wow, I had it really well. And it was eye-opening to me to realize, no, it actually was not common. Well, it's common, it depends. The divorce was growing, and it was more and more, or less and less, a sure thing that you were raised with your original two parents. The divorce was becoming more and more common in the 80s. And that, man, I really had it good. And that was a good appreciation for me to have, that a lot of people had it much worse, either from losing one of their biological parents, or in worst case scenarios, losing both biological parents for whatever reason, maybe being raised by grandparents, or maybe you actually had to go into the foster system and be raised by the state. But I did come to appreciate growing up in the church, which has a moderating effect on us, I look back now and think, oh, actually, overall, that was a pretty good upbringing, and I can't complain about too much.
It really is a blessing to have parents in the church. And I think I learned this from Mr. Milich. I had not thought about it before until I heard him at the feast once when he was talking about the blessing of the little children that we do. And he mentioned, I don't know if it was in a message before the event. I don't think it was just during a prayer of the blessing, but about how we ask that God bless our children in the church, but that frankly, one of the greatest vehicles he uses for that blessing is their parents. Yep. That to say, well, God bless my child, it's not just a matter of divine, miraculous help all the time through his life. A lot of that help comes through the parents. And so by all means, it really is in general a blessing. And yet there really is real life that intervenes. And in particular, because we're not just talking to teens as well, we're talking to young adults. And I know I've counseled a number of adults who were brought into the church and their parents never were, or regardless if they were. I've talked to adults who had abusive parents in the past, and they're looking at a command that says, honor your father and mother, and they're thinking, how do I do that? How do I really do that, Smith?
Especially when their behavior is not at all honorable.
Exactly. So what do you do? So we've kind of broken up this topic into 4 different scenarios, and I think they'll kind of scale up as we go. It's kind of a rough order. Like, for instance, the first scenario that I wanted to bring up was where you just don't get your parents, where it's not necessarily that there's anything terrible going on, but you just don't get it. You just don't understand. Why do they make the calls they do? Why is it that when all my friends get to do something, I don't get to do something? It seems like they're more strict. It seems like they're more, whatever the case is. And, in scenarios like that, I want to highlight what the command says in Exodus chapter 20. And even though Paul is the one who refers to it this way, I kind of want to read it in its original statement. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12, we have the Fifth Commandment. Since we're going to be talking about it, we might as well go ahead and read it, and this is a good place to do it, where it says, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the eternal your God is giving you. Now, I try to highlight that this is not just an individual promise, because individually we do face different circumstances, and there are young people who do honor their parents and for some reason do have a short life, whether it's an accident in which they die, whether it's an unexpected malady or condition that they experience. But it definitely is a promise to society more broadly. It certainly was to Israel, because the land would vomit them out, the Bible says, if they lose track of the command, they don't continue to obey God's commands. And the fact is, and we've mentioned this in other places in the podcast, other episodes, that honoring your father and mother is the foundation of respect. That is the foundation of respect of all institutions and authorities, is beginning with honoring your father and mother. So there's even I don't want to say selfish, that's the wrong way to put it, but you can even focus in terms of, if you feel that it's hard to honor and obey your parents, well, think of it as practice, because Mr. Robinson and I can both attest to the fact that, guess what? Sometimes the authorities in our lives are difficult to obey. Sometimes, whether it's your government, whatever the case might be, it takes a willingness to set aside your personal desires, passions, opinions, etc., and say, what does God expect of me to do here? He expects me to submit. And it's not just a matter of it'll go well for me physically in this life. The fact is, let me paint 2 scenarios. Let's say you're Mr. Robinson, whose parents did a wonderful job. I mean, clearly they must have. Look how wonderful this guy is. But still, talking about what a blessing it was to be reared in the church, and not having, say, some fantastic, strong difficulties with parents whose decisions he just never understood. Well, he's going to be blessed by God for obeying in a case like that. But for, say, someone who kind of struggles in those circumstances, well, that all the more, God attends to that. For a young person who just does not understand his mom and dad's decisions, and they're just frustrating to him, and yet turns to him and says, God, but I want to obey. I want to honor my father and mother. Please help me to have the strength to walk according to how they're asking of me in this time of life where I'm responsible to them. Man, you have God's attention in moments like that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, and I was thinking, especially those teen years where you're transitioning from being a child into being more independent and making your own decisions.
And even looking forward to that time, you know?
Right. You know, that's where a lot of the tension, and so you see your parents make these decisions even imperfectly, but unless you have a real outlier parent, which those do occur, they're still imperfectly trying to protect you from things that can go wrong.
Right.
And it's not your fault. You can be a very intelligent, you could be the valedictorian of your school, whatever, you know, homeschooling and all that. And there's just experiences you haven't had. And I remember one of these books I read, I want to think it was Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters. And they were prepping their daughter to go out with her boyfriend that had been vetted, and they were going to go out. And so this series of questions went on, and all good answers. And then, well, what if he wants to have a beer? Well, you know, maybe if he just has a little beer, that's fine. Well, how much is a little? It's like, I don't know, 5 or 6 bottles. Like, she just didn't know. And there was like the little missing experience detail for them. And in that story, you know, my mom used to get on me when I was, how old was I? 18, 19, that I stayed out too late, which I truly was not doing anything. But she emphasized, hey, nothing good happens after midnight. And I was like, whatever, I'll be fine. And then I got older and I was like, yeah, nothing good happens after midnight. But, you know, that's why it is really important to trust your parents, that they really have your best interest at heart. And it may not make sense then. You know, my daughter Maddie's in her mid-20s now, and I get a lot more. It's not, oh, I just didn't agree with you. It's not things like that. It's just like, now I understand why you did this and that. And, you know, that's not a new story. All of us grow up and understand where our parents are coming from more. What's the Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn quote?
Oh, it's so funny you just brought this up. I was literally just looking it up on the internet, but I don't know if it's out of Huckleberry Finn, but yeah, it is a Mark Twain quote and let me just say, I think this is an accurate quote. I don't have enough time to double check, but I was thinking the same thing. He says, when I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant, I could hardly stand to have the old man around. When I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years. And the fact is that, of course, he's being humorous because he's Mark Twain and making the point that, no, he was the one that learned over the last 7 years, and he began to see his father's decisions differently. So that's what you're thinking of, isn't it, Mr. Robinson? Yeah. So, yeah, let's highlight that at least. And I'll to bring in the Bible, because we're trying to think biblically, don't be offended when this is said. Please don't. Proverbs 22, verse 15. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. That does not mean you are completely dumb. It doesn't mean you know nothing, but there is a transition, and you don't just go from foolishness to just immediately, I understand everything. And I can totally look back on my life and see in my teenage years, even my 20s, you know, after a while, you see that foolishness disappearing as it's replaced by experience. And the fact is, I know this is having been a parent now for quite some time, a parent to 4 adults, I know there's mistakes I made. I know there's judgments I made that were actually the wrong judgment. I made some mistakes. And actually what concerns me is even here, now in my 50s, I'm still learning about some of those things that were mistakes. You know, hopefully I know a lot of them, but I don't know all of them. And the thing is, what takes patience and wisdom is to recognize that right now you might think you know which mistakes your parents are making, which ones they aren't, but over time your judgment is going to change. You are going to discover that some of the calls they made actually were the right calls and that you were wrong. And time and experience hedges in their favor. That as you get older, you're going to discover more and more of their mystery judgments really were very good judgments. And you actually will discover a few that maybe you did agree with, but you grow a little bit and you start to realize, well, you know, actually, I think I would do that differently. But when you're young, there's an onus on you from God to give some default to your parents.
Yes.
And one thing I'll say before we move on to the second point, and that is also, and this will be a theme for all of these points, also feel free and talk with your minister. You know, the pastor in your area is your pastor as well. And there's nothing wrong with actually, if you feel frustrated, actually checking in with your pastor and talking to your minister. But let me say this, don't talk to me and Mr. Robinson. I know it sounds really dumb to say. It's like, well, I guess you don't care about us. Well, no, of course we care about you. But the fact is, sometimes people are like, well, I'll talk to you guys. we are here all the way in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we're just two voices on a podcast. We don't know you. We don't know your family. We're actually the last people that should be counseling you, and sometimes that can be tempting. So that's why we have Disclaimer Guy. And Disclaimer Guy, please address this topic for us.
Listening to the faceless voices of two ministers on a podcast is no substitute for a friendly relationship with your local ministry. It is, however, a good substitute for 87% of modern popular music.
Thank you, Disclaimer Guy. And again, we're not saying don't reach out to us because we don't care. It's quite the opposite. There are people in your life that have been put there that can actually invest in you in a way that we never could. And so we want to make sure that you go to the right place. So let's step it up a notch, Mr. Robinson. Here is another common scenario that might be experienced by many of you out there. And that is when one of your parents is not converted. So you have a parent who attends the church and perhaps is baptized, but perhaps from a marriage, because God doesn't always call both members of a marriage. Sometimes he only calls one.
It is interesting. This is a small digression, but I am amazed, though, how often God calls one spouse. I mean, I don't even want to speculate on a percentage, and over time, the other spouse does eventually come along.
It does.
Would you say that's true?
Oh, not only that, Mr. Robinson, and you may not have been doing this on purpose, but it leads into the scripture I want to bring up. So, yeah, I think you, and I don't think you did know that. I think you're just
no.
You're
Well,
just
I
amazing.
saw you had one coming up, but I didn't.
You didn't think I would use that?
And you know, while you're prepping up to go that direction,
Yep.
I off the top know of a bunch of, let's see, and we're going to be as generic as possible. Let's just say I know a number of solid members of the church who came in a situation like that.
Oh, yeah.
It tended to be the mother was the single, but sometimes there was a dad that was single and helped keep the kids in the church and everything. And they are amazing, solid, trustworthy members of the church. And man, the work it was more often moms did always. I was always in awe of, because it was so much harder to do it that way without the support of the other spouse in what the church was doing.
It can be such a challenge, and I've known where it's been where you have, say, an unconverted mate. Which, by the way, I have yet to hear from someone who says, "Oh yeah, being married to someone outside the church is no big deal." You know, I never hear that.
Phrases we've heard never.
Yeah, exactly. That said, I've heard people say, "Oh, it won't be a big deal," because they thinking they can pull that off. But I've never heard it. I don't want to distract us too much, but I will say, for any of you out there tempted to think, "Oh yeah, I could marry somebody outside the church," you never want to marry someone you cannot share the deepest parts of with you, and they can't get it. It's crazy talk. Yeah. Okay, so don't be distracted. However, I've known some who have a mate who is at least supportive and wonderful people, and you know they'll come for church picnics, they'll come for different kind of things, and they get it, and they get it enough that that could be very nice. On the other hand, I have known cases where the other spouse it seems like perpetually on the edge of divorcing the other person merely because of the irritation, and sometimes they rediscover their own religion that they didn't have before the other person, and suddenly they get more serious, and it's very difficult. So very difficult. Well, this passage, 1 Peter chapter 3, it's speaking to spouses. But I'd like to encourage any of our younger individuals who might be in this circumstance to keep this in mind. 1 Peter 3 and verse 1. Paul is talking to wives, who's very much the example Mr. Robinson was talking about. So I always feel very validated when something we experience is paralleled in the first century church. You know, so here you have this. He says this to wives as if it's more common perhaps than for husbands. But in 1 Peter 3 and verse 1, he says, "Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they, without a word, may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear." And it doesn't mean being terrified. It means the fear of God that's showing in your life. And I'd like to highlight for those of you who, again, we're speaking to how do you honor parents when you're in a circumstance like this, is don't think of that parent who's not in the church as someone not to honor. Think of it rather, well, then how do I figure out how to do that? And one of the best things you can do is just simply set the best example you can.
You know, I witnessed this one time very, very directly. And again, I'll be very, very generic because it's not my story to tell, and I'll just do the basics. But, and this was quite a few years ago, actually. And the mom and the daughter talked very openly about it, and the father was not in the church, and he was a very difficult man to respect. But the mom had, it was almost like a zero tolerance. It was like, look, I get it, I know. Like, she was realistic about the behavior, but you got to respect your father anyway. And it
Right.
was really stood out to me about, we're all being real here. This is a person that's difficult to respect, and they're not in the church on top of it all. But you still got to do it anyway, because that's what God expects. And
Right.
it really, I mean, here I am retelling the basics of that story now, because it's really stood out to me how, like, firm, this is what we're going to do, because it matters. It doesn't so much matter for him necessarily, but it matters to God, because he wants to see that behavior in us.
That sounds exactly like what we're talking about right here. I feel like in a case like that, you have an opportunity, because God is looking to make us better versions of what we are. And when I say what we are, I don't mean in terms of the kind of the world's, idea of how you identify. I mean, for instance, I'm a son.
Mm-hmm.
I was a son before I came into the church, and I was a son after I came into the church. Well, God's laws and ways should make me a better son.
Yes.
And so my mother is a good example. I know it bothered her that I did not keep Christmas. It really did. It virtually, I can't say just virtually, it did offend her that I stopped keeping Christmas, because my mom neither of my parents were in the church. And my mother, though she was not particularly religious, but man, Christmas time, it was like a religion unto itself. Decorations, she loved the presents, loved all of that. And then now I'm not doing it. It was like a personal judgment on her every Christmas that came around. But that said, I can't compromise with God. I did, in every other way I can think of, become a better son. I wish I had been even better, but in terms of my care and concern for her, in terms of wanting to check in on her, in terms of all of those things, I like to think when my mother comes up in the second resurrection, and her mind is open and she's able to evaluate things without, any kind of bitterness about, that she'll look back and see that in the end, I was a better son in all of these other arenas. I was more dependable. I was, whatever the case may be. And that hopefully I will have done her a favor at that time by having been an example of what she now is going to understand, as opposed to her learning something new in the second resurrection and having to think back and ignore my past example. Hopefully it was better for that. So, there's actually an example that's related to the sons of Korah that I want to save for later. And I'm so grateful for Mr. Rod McNair's sermon here in Charlotte that brought that up, because it kind of applies in this circumstance, but I kind of want to save it for later. But before we go on to the next point, we'll just add, even here, feel free and engage with your minister. I feel like that's, for many youth in our church, the local minister is an untapped resource. There's no reason you can't begin a relationship with your pastor or your elder in your area right now. So by all means, feel free and engage that as well. You'll find a lot of these ministers have actually lived in similar circumstances, like I can relate to. And so you never know. I just want to use it as an opportunity to mention that. All right. Third point, Mr. Robinson?
Third point.
All right. Third point, and this one is really heavy. And again, we have some listeners who are not in the church. So let me just go ahead and get it out there. And that is a circumstance where you are truly being mistreated in some way or abused in some way. And I do want to say, in terms of, we're not talking about the world trying to convince you are, because today's society, really, it's not the healthiest for children or for teenagers in terms of this audience to really understand what does it mean, what are the parents' actual rights, et cetera. But at the same time, there really is mistreatment that does take place. I grew up in the world, and I taught high school in the world. And of course, it's a reality to see kids who are not actually being treated by their parents in the way they should be.
Yeah. I wish everything I'm thinking about adding, I question whether or not I can say it on the podcast, but let's just say over the last 20 something years, having been able to avoid this kind of thing growing up, but you start relating with either kids or often adults that went through it and are still kind of scarred by it. And you hear their stories if they tell them, and it's like, wow. I mean, I underestimate how much of this is going on out in the world.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's easy to do that. I was shocked as I got older. I would say It was particularly a range in my teen years, like y'all might be. And this, by the way, this might apply to someone you know that's not you, you know. But in my teen years, up until my very early 20s, I would say around there, how many people I knew that came to a point where they felt the need to unburden themselves about their past experiences and how dramatically abusive it was. I mean, really, it was a surprising number of individuals that I knew. One particular person, actually, not in the church. This was, younger and in the world, but actually was even in her church, actually, that particular church that she attended, which was a worldly church. But we're not going to linger on this because, again, I don't want to tempt you to think that you should reach out to us in particular, but at the same time, you do need to reach out if you're in a case like that. Yes. You have adults in your life you can reach out to. If you're listening to this podcast, you are surely, for instance, a member of the Living Church of God, and that is something you should reach out to your pastor to do. And in the context you should reach out to your shepherd, your pastor, in a circumstance like that. But let me add to this, again, in the context of honoring your father and mother, let me just reassure you, it is not dishonoring your parents to reach out for help in a circumstance like that. God was not trying to, it's like, for instance, it's very rare, thankfully, but we'll have situations where a wife who is being abused by her husband, generally a husband who's not in the church, and she'll reach out, and let the church know, and the church can counsel in a case like that and kind of help advise in terms of how to address the situation. She's not disrespecting her husband. She's not disobeying God in that regard. If anything, and this will kind of get more into, it's actually, I think it's a little easier to cover in the fourth case that we're going to talk about. But it's not disobeying God in terms of honoring these individuals to take actions in such a way to protect ourselves when they are behaving so how do we say, and dishonorably in a way that is literally damaging us, in a way that's literally damaging us and our bodies. It's not dishonoring them to do that. Don't let anyone try to use, say, God's command in a way that, well, like he talked about the Pharisees, where they were so twisting of God's commands, they turn his commands into terrible burdens that they wouldn't even lift themselves, because that's not what God intended by that. God never intended you to not bring up to another adult that you are actually being abused just because of that command. In fact, eventually such parents, I truly believe this, that there are parents in the world, because again, I taught schools out in the world, and I believe that there are parents that are actually, given how long ago that was, some of them are surely dead now, that will come up in the second resurrection, and they will feel the weight of their behavior. They will feel all of that. And if there had been an intervention in their lives, even in some cases, if it was jail time, they'll be able to look back with a proper perspective and be grateful for the intervention. They'll be grateful for what has taken place, that eventually, in some cases, again, they were arrested because they recognize how abhorrent such behavior is to God, and that such intervention was helpful, that in the end, looking at things from that kind of perspective. But it is the exact opposite of the way God intended the parental-child relationship to be, and it's not dishonoring a parent to actually seek out help. Again, if you're in the church, you have a pastor to talk to, and it's not dishonoring to do that.
It's not the first time I've read this scripture, and if I spend too much time trying to find a scripture while Mr. Smith is talking, it's distracting. But so forgive that I don't have the scriptural reference right off the top. But there's many scriptures dedicated to modern Israel going into captivity,
right?
And how many of, since I'm an American, I'll just say us in that context. How many of us Americans and modern Ephraimites and Manassites and Israelites in general, Jews, are going to die in the Great Tribulation, but the response and the attitude, and one of the verses says, you will abhor yourself. Yeah. Like, you're going to come out. However God is going to manifest things, it's going to be quite clear that he gets the attention of those who survive and are appalled at the behavior that they have. And so I have to believe that a little of that, at least, when people come up in their resurrection, there has to be at least a little of that in their lives to, you're going to have some kind of memory of the behavior you had before, even though I still, again, unsupported, what do we call that?
Speculation?
Unsupported speculation.
Wild speculation? I'm not sure
Not
what we
wild
call it.
speculation, just... No, that's just distracting from things. Just that we may not have to go confront people and make them feel bad, that they're going to come with that kind of baked in an awareness of their behavior in the past and that they're embarrassed by it.
Oh, yeah. And really, I think part of what we'll be doing in the millennium in particular, and then also the second resurrection, that period, as the family of God, when we're actually working with someone to tell them, hey, don't turn to the right, don't turn to the left, go straight, that's going to be teaching and counseling. And some of that is going to be helping people see things in perspective if they don't already. But I do think, and that's part of what repentance is, just like Job went through, is coming to a place where you truly see yourself the way God does. And that does involve seeing his love for you. But actually, when you actually comprehend God's love for you, it makes you feel all the more that you wish you'd never committed a single sin.
Yep.
You wish you had never, ever turned from him in any kind of way. So I do think that'll be a part of that.
I only have one thing that I really wanted to share because I thought it was such a good idea. And your mention of like this parent-child relationship is kind of the closest to it. And we just have one more point left, right?
We do. That's right.
It's something Dr. Laura Schlesinger, I've mentioned her before. Her heyday was really in the 90s and maybe into the early 2000s. And she had a conservative talk radio show, but people would call in for advice in their relationships and families. And she's like, she answered like a Jewish mother because that's kind of who she is. So she could be pretty hardcore about her answers. But she would get people that would call up that were now adults or going to be adults and traumatized by the very things you're talking about, abusive behavior that they had while growing up. And she would remind them, I thought this was a good way of putting it, that you have two chances at the parent-child relationship. So if you grow up and through no fault of your own, you had abusive parents in some way or one abusive parent, and you didn't have a great childhood, you can grow up. I think this is important because of how do we put an end to this cycle? Well, the way we can put an end to this cycle is you grow up and you do it the right way and not the way you were treated growing up. Because you will grow up, you'll get married, you'll have kids, and how are you going to treat your kids? So all too often, unfortunately, it's a pattern.
It repeats itself.
Yeah. Because I could never understand growing up why women would ever stay with an abusive man, and then 25, 30 years of experience later, you at least understand why that's the case. But how does this behavior keep perpetuating itself? Well, people don't know better, and they just repeat how it was. But that's how you're going to break the cycle, is you will raise your kids imperfectly, but you will raise them in a loving way where that's the opportunity you have that you didn't have, but you can share with your children. And I always thought it always gave callers hope when she would say that to them. She would bring it out every so often. And I thought, man, what a good point that is, that just because you had a bad childhood doesn't mean your children need to have a bad childhood.
Right. Wow, that's a wonderful point to make. If anything, it'll tie actually into our next point, but it also reminds me of Romans 8, where God really does say how things work for good. That for good isn't always you'll immediately be happy, etc., but rather that's a larger good that whenever Christ does return, we're on the other side of things, we'll look back on and see how God was able to use that for great things. We'll see, like you do see how your children were reared with a perspective that you had, that you said, well, look, I may not have had the best rearing, but I can learn from that, because the Bible does give us both good examples and bad examples to learn from. And if I've learned something that says, you know what, I'm going to look to God to see how not to do that and to do better than that and be upfront, and do differently with my children, then you can turn those terrible circumstances into into something spiritually profitable. Yep. And it kind of does tie into the last point, this kind of fourth category, if you will, because we also know we're talking to young adults. We're not just talking to young, say, pre-adults. We're talking to adults. And I have had a number of people over the years when I was in the field who've come to me and say, hey, Mr. Smith, my dad was a terrible, abusive jerk, and here I am now. I've got an adult relationship with him. And how do I honor such a man? I don't even know if I get in his presence, he just starts yelling at me. Just, how can I honor such a person? And that is a challenge, but it doesn't mean that suddenly the commandment doesn't apply. It means we just have to really think prayerfully about how to do that. And one thing I would highlight is once you are an adult, there's no obligation to obey anymore. You are your own household. You're not bossed around by that person. You have your own choices to make. And also, what does honoring a parent look like in some circumstances? Well, let me give you a real life kind of example. I have known some adults in the church whose parents were, say, alcoholics. And when they're not drinking, they're fine and good to be with. Yep. And then times when their first bottle becomes the first of, I'm going to say 18, but a bunch, and they recognize that's when they don't want to be there. And in that particular case, for instance, and don't overgeneralize this. You really do need to think about it on a case-by-case basis. But I've highlighted individuals, sometimes you honor them by not being there to witness such behavior. Yeah. And that's actually kind of a biblical precedent too. In Genesis chapter 9, there's the case where Noah got drunk. He was not a perfect person. He was clearly righteous enough. God wanted to use him but at the same time, he had his faults. And I got to admit, if the entire world had been killed, and then I'm just me and my family left, that might have been pretty stressful. Hopefully I wouldn't get drunk. But we have in Genesis 9 the tale where Noah did. He did get drunk. And there's this whole situation, I'm not going to go into all the details about it, but regardless, he's essentially naked. Mm-hmm. And his sons who come, Shem and Japheth, they actually, rather than view their father's nakedness and his shamefulness, they actually turn aside and they kind of take a blanket over their shoulders and kind of walk backwards to him so he can be covered in whatever shameful state he's in. And that seems like a very specific circumstance, but think of the principle there. They wanted to do their best to honor their father, mm-hmm. and they, in a sense, did it by not viewing him in that state. And there's something, too, because where you have, say, a parent who does maybe shameful things, sometimes we honor them by not being there to witness that, and actually saying, you know what, Mom, even sometimes we need to let them know.
Yep.
Mom, Dad, as an adult, we say, in fact, I've known men who've done this. I love you, but I'm not going to be here to witness this. I'm not going to, I'll tell you what, I'll come back another time. Yep. And that is not dishonoring your parents. Nope. Honestly, just like Noah's sons did. It's a way of honoring them in those terrible circumstances.
Well, relationships at their core are defined by boundaries. I mean, when you look at the 10 Commandments, it's in some ways a list of boundaries. And you have, there's not gray area. It's along a spectrum, your relationships. But there's a point you get to in your own relationship, your husband and wife relationship, brother and sister relationship, all of it, where you get to a point you're like, look, that's not okay. And most reasonable people would agree that that's not okay. And sometimes you can have your best relationship and respect your parent that's maybe not deserving of it you're going to just have to have some boundaries with them. And
right.
That's not wrong. And that's not disrespecting them to draw some hard lines. Hey, look, Dad, love you. Like to hang out with you, or Mom, whatever. But when you behave in X manner, I just can't be around you. I have to take my kids home, whatever. There's a lot of reasons for it. Drawing boundaries can actually be one of the best, and sticking to them. Don't fold on your boundaries when you've drawn them. Hey, I want to be with you, want to spend time with you, whatever it is that you want to do, but it is okay for you to put in, but not under these circumstances.
Yep. As an adult, you almost have especially once you have children, for their sake, you kind of have an obligation. They might say, well, these are my grandchildren. It's like, well, I'm sorry, but yeah, I want them to grow up honoring and respecting you. And so together we're not going to see in these circumstances. So yeah, we have to think about what it means to honor, especially when you're an adult. It doesn't just mean obey. We have to craft that. In fact, I think one of the best examples of having a challenging parent whom we can honor in a certain kind of way is actually in the Bible with Korah. I think the example of Korah, who was deeply involved in the rebellion of Numbers 16 against Moses. You have Korah and Dathan and Abiram saying, well, you take on yourself too much, Moses. And, well, how disrespectful were they? Well, God decides to eat them with planet Earth, so.
And his rebellion is listed in Jude as one of the attitudes you don't want to have.
That's right. How bad do you have to be mentioned at the beginning of the Bible, and then you're still being mentioned at the end of the Bible as a bad example?
Yeah, we didn't forget about that.
That's right. So you have a case like that, but it's interesting, and I have to fully credit Mr. Rod McNair, and I will make sure that I'll make sure, I'll do my best to post a link to his sermon about this on the livingyouth.org website. But he actually he talked about this because the Bible talks about even their families being eaten up by the earth, but not all of them. And in particular, the sons of Korah were not eaten by the earth. I say eaten by, I always picture it when I say that like a Pac-Man, but still he opened up the earth and they went down. And it says very specifically, for instance, in Numbers 26 and verse 11, it says, nevertheless, the children of Korah did not die. It does talk about the families of the others, but specifically they did not, and that is fascinating. And so you look throughout history, and Mr. McNair teases this out in his sermon. The sermon's titled "The Surprising Legacy of the Sons of Korah." And if you want just a sample, because I'm not going to go through this whole sermon, you need to listen to it, but you could turn in your Bible to Psalm 42, and it never struck me until he said this.
Oh, yeah.
But the subtitle there of Psalm 42, one of several, it says that it's a psalm of the sons of Korah. And they are straight up of the lineage of Korah from the Numbers rebellion. And that is another way in which you honor parents, even when maybe they have not been the most honorable in your past, if you're an adult. And you can actually, going back to the earlier point 2, I think, or so, you can work on as a teen, is that you can honor your parents by your choice of behavior. You will eventually carry on that name. You represent, whether you're a boy or a girl, because, girls change their names in Western culture, well, at least some Western cultures, but you'll carry on and people remember, oh, you're so-and-so's son or so-and-so's daughter. Well, these guys, if you look, these all the way up to the Psalms, and then they have honored their father Korah. If it weren't for them, what would be the only memory of the name of Korah is that he got eaten by the earth.
Yep.
But yet there are psalms that are named after his sons that continue to have his name on them and will have them as long as the word of God endures, that says this is a psalm of the sons of Korah. And that is an honoring of their parents. I do think my father did not know the truth. My mother did not know the truth. And I think my grandparents, but yet at the same time, I like to think that, I hope that I can be such with my children and myself and the instruction I give and any grandchildren that arrive or great-grandchildren, that hopefully they will come up in the second resurrection and be able to look at the lineage that happened after them. And that the honor will come to them for that, and that others might know and hear of those things and say, "Man, you had some good kids, you had some good grandkids."
And I'd be curious to see what your percentage is. Okay, on the following comment, which is what the sons of Korah did is rare. How many people have we witnessed just observing things in the church over the last 30 years? A member of the family gets upset, they leave the church, and and not invariably, but so often the whole family goes, extended family goes. Like when people are upset about what's happened in the church and they leave, large sections of the family leave, but not always. And the ones that are left behind often are put under a tremendous amount of pressure by
all the family members leaving, right?
Exactly. So it's, all the more my hat's off to people that make that stand, because that is very difficult to do.
It is difficult because often the leaving individual who thinks of himself as a patriarch or a matriarch or something will kind of paint it as though those who are remaining are dishonoring them in some way. But you have to understand, you don't honor someone by sinning against God. You don't think, well, I'm going to honor God by I'm going to honor my parent rather by turning my back on God. No, in that case, you're actually honoring them, and the name that you bear from them by actually saying, no, we're going to stick with God.
Yep.
And that's exactly what the sons of Korah did.
Yep.
So we know that we're not pretending God is asking us to obey in a perfect world. Going back to marriage, when God tells husbands to love their wives and he tells wives to honor their husbands, he was not pretending it's a perfect world.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, he was telling them still there is benefit to this. There's benefit in this world, but even more than that, there is spiritual benefit because you become more like me when you focus on these things.
You know, and God, since I've had to learn myself, he is far more realistic about the messy little life I'm gonna.
He is. He understands.
He gets it. Like we're like, I'm not doing it perfectly. God's like, yeah, I know. You know?
I'll work with you. Work with
Right,
me.
exactly.
We'll work on it.
You know, looking for improvement, looking for getting it down a little better each year, even though we'll make mistakes, and he knows it'll be messy. That's one of my favorite. John O'Gwen kind of riffs, if I will. You know, he reads a scripture, and it's you know, the disciples are getting kind of discouraged, so they go back to going fishing, and they're not catching anything. And Christ, you know, comes up on the beach and
Right after his resurrection, right? Yeah.
gives them. You have to understand that by fishermen's standards, Christ gives them terrible advice. Okay, tells them to throw their net in over here. They're like, "Look, nobody would do that who's a fisherman, but because it's you, we're going to do it because you said so." And they pull up an amazing amount, and it really hits Peter like a bolt of lightning.
Oh, yeah, that was early, right? Not the resurrection account. That's right.
Yeah,
that was early
sorry.
on, right. Now I'm
Did
gonna
I
set up.
put in bad
No, that was me.
information? Okay.
I said that.
And
It hits Peter.
you know, it hits Peter, and he tells Christ, you know, go away from me. I'm a sinful man. And I can just only imagine Christ's thoughts. And he was like, look, I already knew that. You know, I needed you to know that.
Right.
But that made him, of course. I think from then on, they were pretty dedicated to serving Christ at that point.
Oh yeah, I think that was a big deal. That was the big deal, and that's really what we're saying. The commandment to honor your father and mother. It doesn't need a perfect world for you to figure out how to do it. This world can make it challenging in a lot of different ways. But here's the thing: if you go to God not with excuses or with reasons why you think it's impossible for you to obey him, but if you go to him and ask for help to do so, ask for wisdom to do so, ask for God to help you have a heart for obeying him and to help you figure out how to do it. He will work with you. That's exactly the attitude he's looking for, is for someone who is devoted to obeying him. And even if they don't exactly know how, in their circumstance, they want to know how. If you go to God with a desire to obey him in this command and all of his commands, even in unusual circumstances, just trust and have faith that he loves you for that, and he longs to help you to do that.
Smith and Robinson.